Okay, welcome. Thanks for coming here, guys. I appreciate everyone's time today and interest in sulfate and wild rice sulfate and joining us to learn more about it. My name is Suzanne Bauman. I am the MPCA Municipal Wastewater Manager. So as you may know from the invitation, this is the third meeting in a series to share information with NPDES permit holders about the implementation plan for the wild rice sulfate standard in NPDES, which are surface water discharge permits. So this meeting and what we're planning on covering today builds on the previous two informational meetings and the materials that were provided to support those meetings. So just to summarize some of the past effort and past meetings, May 24th, we had an informational meeting, and that's where we talked about where the standard applies, effluent monitoring, and how PCA will determine if effluent limits are needed. We had a meeting at the end of June 28th, to talk about what options exist if your facility needs a permit needs a limit, and you're not able to immediately comply with the limit. And we also talked about the draft site-specific standard framework. So we're not going to plan on reviewing any of that previous content that was covered in those earlier two meetings. If you missed those meetings and you're interested in that content, the information is available on the website, which is on that slide there. You could write down the web link right there, or you could just go to the PCA's webpage and type wild rice into the search box and you will find that page. This meeting will also be recorded. You probably got a notification as you joined that the meeting is being recorded. We will edit out all of our small talk as we are waiting for folks to join in the lobby, and post this meeting shortly after as well for folks who, if you know, are interested in this meeting but weren't able to make it. So the plan for today is to walk through the feedback that we've received to date on our plan to implement the standard. There will be other folks from the PCA who will be joining us, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves as they do. And then I'm going to turn it over to University of Minnesota Duluth Natural Resources Research Institute, NRI, to talk about the research and the work that they're doing to advance sulfate treatment technologies. So just some logistics before we get into some of the content. There are a lot of folks on this meeting. Teams automatically defaults to cameras off and microphones off unless you are a presenter, but the chat should be working. All right, I think that's all I have for the introduction. I'm going to turn it over to Steve Weiss to start talking about the feedback that we received.
Thanks, Suzanne. My name is Steve Weiss. I supervise the Effluent Limits Unit at the MPCA. And I'm going to be summarizing some of the feedback that we received on the document my staff and I developed entitled Procedures for Implementing the Class 4A Wild Rice Sulfate Standards in NPDES Wastewater Permits in Minnesota. I refer to this as simply the procedures or the implementation procedures. I want to credit the work of my staff, Dennis Wasley, Matt Linden, Emily Brault, and Scott Kaiser, who did a phenomenal job of developing this manual under a tight timeline. We began implementing sulfate in some mining and power plant permits some years ago. At direction of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the MPCA is now fully and consistently implementing the state's existing water quality standard for sulfate. About 70% of our individually permitted facilities discharge upstream of a water used for production of wild rice, or you may see the acronym WWOOF power. We understand that monitoring and getting variances come at a cost to permittees. We're continuing to work on potentially more economically viable variance options through a multi-discharger variance, or MDV. Regardless of the cost to permittees, the MPCA is required by law to implement, through its NPDES program, standards that have been approved by EPA. MPCA is limited to tools provided by the Federal Clean Water Act, but is looking to other states to examine models for how these states have implemented difficult to treat pollutants through NPDES wastewater permits. We're open to ideas, but recognize that there are legal constraints. Next slide. If we dig a little bit deeper into the specific themes that we received through feedback on the implementation procedures, they might break out into three general groups: standards, permitting approaches, and limit evaluation details. Keep in mind that the document at the heart of this, the implementation procedures, is designed to provide instruction to a new staff, or perhaps an outside party or another agency that wants to have a general reference on the main principles of our sulfate limit setting process. It's supposed to be an internal technical manual. As well, the topics that I highlight are certainly not exhaustive, but they hit some of the breadth of feedback that we received. Next slide. By far, the most frequently received comment was enforce the standard. And I believe that this was directed probably more to the site-specific standards framework, but there is an obvious connection to effluent limit setting. Our implementation procedures document, Appendix C and D, and you can see a couple screenshots here, are examples that these are the examples in the document that demonstrate use of the 10 milligram per liter sulfate standard to evaluate and calculate limits. In fact, that is the only standard that is referenced throughout that document. If we have a site-specific standard, something other than 10 that has gone through the administrative process, we will certainly use that, but at the time, 10 is what we have. It was also requested that we protect low sulfate concentration waters. Our anti-degradation rules, Minnesota rules 7050.0290, and many of those parts that follow that, they're explicitly designed to provide protection for waters that are better than the water quality standard. Or in other words, those where the long-term average concentration is less than 10 milligrams per liter sulfate. Also, it was suggested that new dischargers should conduct research on downstream wild rice waters, that we should require 6+ years of mesocosm studies. Mesocosm studies would be studies where wild rice might be growing in a tank in more of a laboratory type setting, and that they would use site-specific seeds or sediments. This comment is noted. We will continue to have a slow trickle of new and expanded discharge proposals, as we have for the past 50 years. They will vary considerably in size and content, as well as distance from wild rice waters and their potential proportion of impact. All of this is going to need to be taken into consideration. Another piece of feedback stated that we should not include limits if downstream wild rice is thriving and sulfate exceeds 10 milligrams per liter. The situation here would be like the lower Mississippi River, pools 7 and 8, and some of their backwaters. Long-term data here shows that rice has expanded over the past 20 years, but sulfate is still above 10 milligrams per liter. Should a facility get limits if the downstream wild rice water is thriving? It's worth mentioning that the existing wild rice standard is not equipped with a response variable, like river or lake eutrophication standards, where we have total phosphorus typically paired with chlorophyll, a measure of algae. As such, we're limited in our flexibility for making assessment and limit determinations. Essentially, 10 is 10, that's the standard. Some of these waters may be good candidates for site-specific standards, standard that would more accurately represent the level at which these waters might not or be healthy and thriving. For permitting, we need to have some kind of a water quality endpoint, whether it be 10, the existing standard, or an approved site-specific standard. Some schools of thought might encourage us to hypothetically set the standard at current levels of water quality. If rice is thriving, it's worth noting that if this were done, most upstream dischargers would still trip reasonable potential and therefore would require limits because we evaluate the full permitted capacity and not the past historical output. A site-specific standard would only have notable differences in the limit outcomes if it were some margin above current levels, because this additional capacity would allow for facilities to operate under all conditions allowed by their permits. We've given this concept a lot of thought and have deferred modifications to the standard to our water quality standards unit through the framework. We acknowledge that there are waters that are good candidates for site-specific standards. My unit, the effluent limits unit, plans on leading development of a more nimble permitting process. Next slide. Another group of comments is related to permitting approaches and mechanisms. One writer commented that our approach was in contradiction with the session law, the legislation in 2017, and that was leading up to that. It stated that we could not require permittees to expend money on the design or implementation of sulfate treatment technologies. We're aware of this session law. It's a legal matter, and therefore we would defer to our legal services unit on this matter. The implementation procedures document is not intended to be a legal analysis. It's technical. I bring up this topic because it was provided to us, and I wanted to capture the breadth of feedback that we received. Also had comments that mentioned that treatment is cost prohibitive. Yes, treatment costs could be very expensive and indeed infeasible for many permittees. In 2018, a treatment analysis report was completed, and it provides cost estimates that serve as the basis for variance eligibility for many, but not necessarily all permittees. It was also suggested that we develop a multi-discharger variance, or MDV. Yes, we are in the process of developing an MDV. We have already begun to investigate MDVs in other states to examine models that might fit this circumstance. This may involve rulemaking, and as such could take a few years to complete. I personally have been able to gain a position in my unit with the intent of having one person primarily working on developing and implementing a sulfate multi-discharger variance. I don't want to go too far afield, but we have entered an era where we're monitoring more problems than we can immediately fix. Minnesotans want to know about a wider range of issues, even if there isn't a quick fix. And we need to have permitting mechanisms that can acknowledge difficult to treat issues that take more time to fix, while providing the push to make progress where we can. We can't make improvements in permits if we aren't reissuing permits. An MDV isn't about letting permittees off the hook, but rather making space to reissue permits where we can continue to make progress. Next slide. The final group of highlighted topics includes limit setting details. Multiple notes instruct us to set sulfate limits to address mercury methylation or excess nutrients. To be clear, our implementation procedures are intended to control sulfate for the protection of wild rice, not necessarily mercury or methylation. We have a sulfate wild rice standard, a separate mercury standard, and of course, eutrophication standards that protect against excess algae due to phosphorus. Mercury methylation is very complex. Our watershed division is currently developing a TMDL with a goal of better understanding causes in order to reduce rates of methylation. Another letter stated that our boundary condition is not sufficient to control discharges from having reasonable potential, which is a test used to determine whether a limit is necessary. Implementing the wild rice sulfate standard is different than many others in that there's often a distance between the outfall point and the wild rice water. In some cases, it could be a dozen miles. In other cases, it could be a couple hundred miles. Ambient data are empirical evidence that either dilution or transport losses are sufficient to prevent intermediate waters from contributing to a downstream impairment. It's important that we use data to help us make decisions and direct our attention. The total number of facilities that might be impacted by a boundary condition principle is relatively small, and more so the downstream waters typically have more pressing impacts from larger sources. The final two areas of feedback involve variables within the equation we use to determine whether limits are necessary and calculate limits. First of these, the 70% average wet weather design flow. This is designed to simulate a municipal wastewater treatment plant operating at full capacity on a long-term average basis. There was no intent to try to replicate climate conditions or the inflow and infiltration that might be generated through certain climate events. Some permits are also rated with an annual average design flow. And what we've noticed too is that 70% of average wet weather design flow in many cases is very close to average design flow. The 365 Q10 river flow is an in-stream flow statistic that represents a 1 in 10 year annual low flow value. It's not a super low flow statistic. It's much closer to average annual flow than other flows that we use, like a 7Q10 or a 30Q10 for limit setting. It prevents the recurrence of back-to-back annual average conditions. Research demonstrates that short durations, exceedances of the standard do not have negative effects on wild rice. However, frequent recurrence of higher concentration conditions do. The rice needs a reprieve. This is all based on the general assumption that higher pollutant concentrations may align with lower flows, because in general, some pollutants have a higher likelihood of coming from point sources. We see this for sulfate in some watersheds where baseline sulfate concentrations are low and there are discrete large sources. In other watersheds, however, the range of sulfate is more dependent upon how storms hit the watershed. This is the end of the summary of implementation procedures feedback. Next, Megan Hemken will discuss feedback on the framework. She's a research scientist in our Water Quality Standards Unit, and she's one of the primary authors of the framework.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Steve, for that introduction. I have basically the same thing written. Research scientist in the Water Quality Standards Unit, and I'm part of the team working on sulfate site-specific standards here at the PCA. So, as you all know, earlier this summer, PCA published the framework for developing and evaluating site-specific sulfate standards for the protection of wild rice, which outlined what we deem as an acceptable justification for a sulfate site-specific standard and requested feedback on ways that we could improve the framework. In summary, we received over 300 comments that were submitted on our online portal. These included letters from tribal nations, industry, municipalities, environmental advocacy organizations, EPA Region 5, and a significant number of comments from the public. And given the sheer amount of feedback we received, today I'll only be touching on some general points of clarification and then some broader themes of the feedback, but I will not be reviewing the entirety of the feedback received. Next slide, please. So before we dive into some of these more policy and technical-based feedback, I'd like to begin by addressing some general confusion regarding what a site-specific standard is and what it is not. The process of deriving and justifying a site-specific standard is distinctly separate from a statewide rulemaking, and it is not a process for broadly exempting facilities across the state, which was a phrase that we saw in a number of comments. Any application would likely pertain to a single water body, as this is again not a broad scale change to the 10 milligrams per liter water quality standard. The statewide standard remains in place, it remains in force, and as Steve described, we are moving towards implementation across all of our Clean Water Act programs, including permitting and impairment decisions. So again, to clarify, the framework is simply setting up guidance and expectations of what to consider when applying for a site-specific standard and what needs to be included. We seek to firmly establish that an applicant must demonstrate that the wild rice would be protected at the proposed sulfate standard in order to receive approval. So any application needs to be reviewed by PCA and EPA before any final decisions are made. Nothing automatically occurs when an application is received. There's no immediate changes to permit conditions, to permit limits, to listing decisions, or other Clean Water Act decisions. Some of the comments portrayed some confusion about if an application comes into play, that there's going to be substantial changes immediately. So we just want to articulate that the framework is really about what needs to be included in the application and is really only the first step of our review, of EPA's review, before there's a final decision, before any permit limits would be changed. So with that understanding in mind, I'd like to move into some of the themes that we pulled out from the feedback. And again, this is not an all-encompassing list, it's just a snapshot. So we received feedback regarding our interpretation of the Class 4A wild rice beneficial use, both that we've interpreted it too specifically and also that we don't define it adequately. Our goal within the framework here is to accurately translate our rule language for the protection of wild rice into metrics that an applicant can then use to adequately demonstrate that the beneficial use will be supported, which is truly the fundamental, the foundation for any site-specific standard. So we do plan to update some of this language in the framework to address some of the comments that we received. We also received questions regarding what methods are allowable for deriving the standard. So this was an area where there seemed to be some substantial confusion regarding the two groupings of approaches that we listed. And we see now how this has been misinterpreted, so we do plan to better clarify this in the framework. But since a site-specific application must demonstrate that the beneficial use will be protected at the proposed sulfate standard, the derivation of that threshold must illustrate an association between the surface water sulfate concentration with metrics that are tracking wild rice abundance and health. So that linkage of those two pieces is absolutely critical for a site-specific standard. And the only known approach to make that direct connection is by applying the current ambient sulfate concentration if the wild rice is demonstrated to be healthy, and thus the beneficial use is met. So this example here, this approach is the group 1 or the standalone / independent approach that we refer to in the framework. So this is now, we're going to clarify that this is simply a requirement. Instead of just saying this is the standalone and independent approach, we're going to clarify our language to make it better understood that that is simply a requirement for a site-specific standard. The second grouping were listed as potential options to support that current condition-derived sulfate threshold, because while the approaches we listed as supporting evidence can be incredibly useful information, they do not link directly to use attainment and showing that the wild rice is protected and healthy. And thus they cannot be used as the sole basis for sulfate standard derivation. So we plan to better clarify how those approaches and the supporting evidence can be utilized to build a defensible application. Further, there were many comments on the use of the 2018 equation from the attempted rulemaking. Both comments encouraging the use of the equation and also those discouraging the equation's use because it's based on outdated science. So I do want to clarify here that we do plan to retain the inclusion of the equation, but to better clarify that it is only allowable as potential supporting evidence. So we're going to make it abundantly more clear about how you can use the equation to support the current conditions approach, and more generally, how the supporting evidence can be used in an application. Next, we received a lot of questions about the data requirements. We were both told that it's an excessive requirement and also that it is insufficient for understanding wild rice population health in a water body. So we'll talk a bit more about that in the framework. Furthermore, when it comes to data, we had questions about how the data will be evaluated, especially considering long-term trends of the boom-bust cycles. We heard from a number of folks that we need to better address confounding factors and the role that they play in wild rice health. So we do plan to include a more significant discussion regarding how to incorporate confounding factors like hydrological changes in the water body into your application for a site-specific standard. And lastly, some commenters allege that the framework and the requirements therein constitute an unpromulgated rulemaking. I'll defer to legal on this, but we do plan to respond to this in the response to feedback documentation. And Suzanne, I will pass it off to you to close out this portion.
Sounds good. Thank you. All right, so I have one quick next steps slide. So for those folks on this call who are NPDES permit holders, you can expect when your permit is reissued to have conversation with your permit writer and other folks at the time that we're talking about setting limits and monitoring requirements and whether those are the next steps for you. And you know, if monitoring is required, what that looks like in your permit. We've talked about the frequencies. You know, if there is monitoring data, what a potential limit would look like. So more to come at the point that your permit is picked up. As it pertains to finalizing the site-specific standard framework, you heard from Megan, there's quite a bit still outstanding and feedback that's in conflict we will plan on responding to feedback that we've received, and we'll put that information on that website. You'll see that website again on the next slide, and we will work toward finalizing that site-specific standard framework. Let's see if I can advance the slide and do two things at one time. So here is that website. You've seen it before. Instead of writing it all down, you can just go to the PCA homepage and type in wild rice in the search bar. Here are some contacts. If you have questions, my contact information, again, I'm the municipal wastewater manager, Jeff Udd, if you're on the industrial side of things. Paul Pestano is the water assessment section manager, also a great contact. Or Dana Vanderbosch has been heavily involved with this. She's the Assistant Commissioner of Water Policy and Agriculture. And so, again, I want to thank you guys for your interest in this topic and your time. Time is valuable. We are interested in this, and we are interested in getting the word out. So I appreciate you being here. So just as a reminder, we will update the Protecting Wild Rice Waters webpage, and we will put the posting of this recording on that website, as well as any additional site-specific standard framework materials. With that, I'm going to turn it over to NRI. We have Rolf and Pat, who will be talking about NRI's work to advance sulfate treatment technology research. I believe they're both here, so I'm gonna pause for a second so that they can unmute and join us. I'm wondering if maybe they're having a hard time unmuting. Let me see if I can do that from here. Allow mic.
Hey, Suzanne, it's Paul. I think you need to assign them as presenters.
Okay.
I have a mic. And okay, camera. And now we need to share.
Okay, are you able to share?
Not at this point. It's not enabled. I'm sorry, you have to look at my face instead of the slides. So.
Do you see an option now to share?
Yep. There it is.
Okay, good.
We are coming.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing.
Okay. To share a tab instead. Okay, we're going to share a window. Share. Look at that. I think we did it. Very good. Can you see that?
We can see it. We can see it.
I can't see a thing, so my colleague Pat Schaff will be making sure that we're on target here. So anyway, Suzanne, thank you for the opportunity to share a little bit of what we're doing today. My name is Rolf Wieberg. I'm the Executive Director here at the Natural Resources Research Institute. I'm joined by Patrick Schaff, who is our Director of Research here at the Institute, and we're very pleased to share with you what we've been up to. I'd like to acknowledge the state legislature for the investment in these demonstration projects, which we're going to be talking about. And as a quick introduction for those of you that may not be as familiar with the Natural Resources Research Institute, it was created by the state legislature as a tool to help make decisions. It was created as an applied research organization focused on Minnesota's natural resources for both economic development, but also developing that under the guise and the belief in sustainable stewardship. That's our state charter, as that's translated into our mission, which is really about delivering, which is important, integrated research solutions instead of mere answers. Solutions are much more comprehensive than an answer, and that's our approach to doing our work, where we do not advocate for policy or programs, but we drive excellence in science, engineering, and economics. We work with all stakeholders to frame the research, build the team, and execute. And working together, our vision is to be one of many who will help discover that economy of the future where all communities, our environment, and our resources all benefit moving forward. So that's a quick thumbnail sketch. And we're, again, very pleased to be here to talk with you today. This first slide really is a redo of what you just reviewed. Sulfate is an issue here in the state. Obviously, the 10 parts per million sulfate is globally unique. NRI, along with other partners, have scoured the globe looking for technologies and applications that can accommodate and look at a 10 part per million sulfate standard. And Minnesota is indeed globally unique, which means that alternate technology approaches are required to meet those demands. And of course, as was already reviewed in the call already this afternoon, is reduction in targets are dependent on multiple factors. We are not playing in that arena. Our focus is how do we provide the tools to meet the sulfate standard. So with no further ado, with the way we have attacked this problem is to really split the sulfate reduction problem into 3 level regimes, as you can see on this slide. The 50 to 250, which really is a significant challenge for municipal water treatment plants that simply cannot afford onboarding of reverse osmosis, for example. There's the 250 to 2000 ppm that's represented by some of our mine pits, industrial impacts, agriculture, etc. And of course, then the greater than 2000 part per million, which is generally associated with power generation. Obviously, natural sources are included in all of these level regimes. One of the points that we've made all along is that each of these challenges may require 2 or more technologies to be applied in combination. And you'll see at the end of the conversation, we call that treatment train, if you will, where one treatment technology might feed another. When we look at the treatment options, this is a quick summary slide of where we looked, where we have been putting a lot of our focus. Reverse osmosis can, if you can afford it, can do pretty much anything along the entire range that we just laid out for you. Biological treatment can also span that range, but it becomes more and more difficult as you get to lower and lower concentrations because of the concentration effects. Adsorption or anion exchange is also a technology that is in practice that we've also been looking at. And then, of course, chemical separation, reactivity, or precipitation is another way to go. You can see the relative costs on the right side, but the key application differentiators are really going to come down to what is the cost of treatment, and therefore efficiency, what are the flow rates that are available, what levels of contamination can they accommodate. Of course, the final target, which is a decision that we've been talking about so far, but the life cycle concerns are also of significant concern because whenever you move a contaminant from one place to another, you have to figure out how to handle where you've moved it. So with reverse osmosis, for example, the sludge from that is something that needs to be handled as a life cycle consideration. So having set that out, the program that we've been driving over the last 4 to 5 years with support from the legislature is the waterborne sulfate reduction program that starts with sulfate in the center of your screen, going after from one approach with a chemical precipitation technology we'll discuss today. The other is to leverage microbial processes. And when I'm talking about microbial processes, we're talking about native microbes, no GMOs or anything like that involved in this work at all. They are locally sourced, if you will, from the local environment. We're working with external expertise in that microbial processes to retard and prevent mercury methylation, which is a significant concern in this technology, to generate the sulfate, which we can collect as either iron sulfide and or sulfur. So what we'd like to do is just walk through where we are with each of these and what we're doing, and more importantly, what we're looking forward to continuing to collaborate with MPCA in rolling these out in demonstration platforms to start deploying this technology as it comes out. So the first where we'd like to start is the barite process, as it's referred to. It's a chemical precipitation process. This is known, it's been known for quite some time for treating high concentrations of sulfate, as in power plants where you need to get the sulfate load out. It's basically a reaction between the sulfate ion and barium chloride, which is soluble in water, to create barium sulfate, referred to as barite, which is highly insoluble, and it literally falls out of solution very quickly. It's a very fast reaction. Nothing's temperature independent, but it is not very impacted by temperature. So what's new? What NRI has done is we've adapted this to less than 200 part per million sulfate concentrations, because adapting the known approach is not very effective and ends up leaving quite a bit of residual ions in the water. What we've developed, as you'll see, is a method that's good for up to 150 to 200 part per million reduction in one step before we start to introduce challenges with excess chloride or barium. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in the discussion. So we started out with a laboratory process, basically taking an influent, which we collected from different areas of the state, adding the barium chloride, a flocculant, letting it sediment or settle, and then filter the material. And you can see in the lower or the upper right, that's the laboratory setup that we use with reactors, flocculation tanks, clarifier, and a sand filter. And as you see in the lower right, we were able to demonstrate in operations at 24/7 over many weeks a reduction in sulfate in that water passing through from 50, 100, 150, and 200 to 10 or less parts per million. So we felt that that was a good first start, and this is what fed the legislative support. Jumping ahead quite a bit, this is a schematic for the pilot process that we have built with legislative support that allows us to take this out of the laboratory and into a larger volume. As you'll see here, you've got the existing wastewater that we'd like to take out of wastewater treatment plants, go to 3 reaction tanks where the barium chloride reacts with the water under agitation. We add a flocculant, and we go to 3 flocculation tanks, each one separating the precipitate. In this case, goes to a plate settler into rapid sand filtration and out. It looks like the following. These are the modules that we built. And on the left-hand side, you got the reaction tank, flocculation, sedimentation. You can see sludge holding, chemical dosing pumps, and the chemical storage tanks all in this unit. Also built the filtration columns and a backwash tank and installed all of it in an 8 by 20 foot trailer, which has been deployed for the last couple of years around the state to demonstrate in water treatment facilities. In 2021, we ran 2 pilot field trials. These were done on site, taking the effluent from the water treatment plants. You can see that 2 different levels here. They ran 24/7 for 2 to 3 months at a time consistently. And in this case, we were able to demonstrate the reduction, as you'll see in the next slide. In the plant number 1, the sulfate level was about 60 parts per million, and we ran it at 2 gallons a minute from June through August. And then we went to a different treatment plant, which was both domestic and industrial wastewater. The industrial wastewater had chelating organics present, which we were wanting to try because those are a confounding issue. The team was able to overcome that challenge As you'll see, the sulfate levels were a little bit elevated in this particular plant, in this municipality, and we were running it a gallon a minute, August through October. Generally speaking, the results were quite promising. You can see there were a number of different kinds of conditions, and in all cases except for a reduced barium dose, we were able to meet or exceed the 10 parts per million limit. Exceed meaning lower than 10 parts per million. So this was a good set of data, and so the following year we did another set of trials in a much different situation. In this case, the sulfate level was 180 to 250 parts per million from a mining impacted water mine pit, and also we tested tap water that resulted from that. You can see the levels at 180 to 250 at about 1.5 gallons a minute over 6 weeks. We, in this case, treated to 10 part per million, 50, 100, and 150. We were in this case trying to see how much we could drop the sulfate level and what the impacts would be on the residuals. We did the same with the tap water. And you can see on the right there that is a picture of the trailer working at that site. This is a bit of a busy slide, but it lays out the results and how we're doing the work. In the blue writing, you can see the initial sulfate concentrations for that period of time we were running the particular tests. You can see the relative amounts of barium chloride added during that process. In the black writing columns, you can see sulfate, chloride, and barium. And you can see the varying levels of sulfate that we adjusted to, but with the penalties in chloride and barium ions in the water afterward in the effluent. Again, we were able to demonstrate a range of effluent for sulfate, and it gave us a really good long-running data set to look at the chloride and barium residuals. And this also leads to the conclusion that at this point in time, about 150 parts per million drop in sulfate is about the limit that we can push with the current technology. So the success is it's a simple system. It's very adaptable to existing treatment systems, i.e. no CapEx in order to onboard this, very little CapEx. It's very rapid reaction time, not affected by temperature in any great way. And as I said, the 150 to 200 part per million sulfate reduction is feasible. The challenges are the potential chloride and barium effluent. We got a limit of 250 for secondary drinking water standard for chloride and 2 parts per million for a primary drinking water standard for barium. And of course, it produces a different sludge, which needs to be further treated or disposed of. So what are the next steps? We are driving forward with extended field demonstrations to further refine the process parameters. We are going to be demonstrating the utility for dual phosphate and sulfate removal in a single step, which would be an extra benefit. We're also adding ion exchange capability for chloride and barium management so that we can, I think, fortify our position that 150 to 200 parts per million drop is feasible. We're driving towards commercial application with providing engineering designs and drawings and developing cost estimates for water treatment facility application. And a third point is we're developing secondary use for that barite, the barium sulfate. There are many uses for it, from drilling muds all the way to potential drywall compositions that can block radiation, and we're actively looking at those. So those are the three prongs of the development and demonstration that we're working with, of course, with collaboration with MPCA. So I'll shift over to the second biological approach. And this is taking the sulfate using the native microbes, feeding them properly to generate sulfate that we trap as either iron sulfide or sulfur. What we're driving right now is an in situ bioremediation approach. This is something that's been deployed at contaminated sites around the country for acid mine drainage and petroleum impacted sites. It employs, again, natural processes, and it can be semi-passive or passive. On the lower right, you can see this is a very standard depiction of water coming in. It's basically an engineered wetland that the material passes through, gets converted, and then precipitated out at the end. So the challenges here are to supply the right food for the microbes to do their job and remove the sulfide by precipitation or other processes. What we've really driven here is the concept of an electrochemical bioremediation. In a silly sense, it's tickling the microbes to make them do their job more efficiently. So what we do, as you can see here, is a bit of chemistry, but we can generate hydrogen at the cathode, which enhances the microbes to convert sulfate to sulfide, which can be caught by iron precipitation, or as well as elemental sulfur formation, both of which take the sulfur out of the system. And it's also a potential for direct electron exchange, as you can see on the far right, that generates sulfide that can undergo the same fate. So in essence, adding the electrochemical bioremediation to a typical engineered wetland is the path forward. We have demonstrated this in lab flow-through demonstrations. You can see in the upper right picture, here's a picture of how it operates as the water flows from left to right. The sulfate in these models, in these demonstration modules, is demonstrated up to 1,000 parts per million decrease over pore volumes at 3 volts potential across the cathode and anode. So what we're moving forward with in the demonstration phase is to take a conceptual field plot approach and take, if you will, that engineered wetland, literally put it into a trailer where we have a design where we're developing a engineered wetland that has the electrode cells inserted into it to enhance the conversion and capture. It's going to be a large trailer. We'll be using this for a residence time of 2 to 5 days and demonstrate the reduction of the sulfate from wherever it is in the particular area. I think we're just going to be starting in the neighborhood of a source of 500 parts per million and seeing how far down we can get it. The other piece that we're going to be combining it with in a 2-phase in situ bioremediation effort, where the unit that I just described to you, the electrode integrated biofiltration system, will be coupled with a phytoremediation experiment in collaboration with the U.S. Forest Service. As some of you may know, NRI has been working on hybrid poplars for some time. We just commercialized our first one called Innova Tree. And these varieties have been found by this collaboration to be quite effective in absorbing sulfate and taking it out of the water. So we are in the process of putting together this 2-phase in situ bioremediation demonstration in collaboration with our friends at MPCA. So as I said, the next steps is to build this treatment system, drive that field demonstration, and carry forward with the collaboration. And in closing, the treatment train concepts that I alluded to in the first part of the discussion is depicted here, whereas in a 50 to 250 parts per million challenge, we might be able to take the barite process and bring it to a level consistent with what can be released to the environment, depending on what the dilution factors are or other. Alternatively, it could be fed into a phytoremediation wetland, if you will, or a phytoremediation site before it goes into the environment. Again, a way to link these opportunities, and obviously the one below is a similar argument where something over 250 will likely need to start with a biological treatment, may use a barite process, may use a phytoremediation on the way to release to the environment. So that's a very, very fast, high-level overview. We are working very hard on both of these processes, not just to demonstrate it, but also to really understand the utility, the life cycle impacts, and of course, most importantly, the cost per unit water. So with that, I'll thank you and I'll turn it back over to you, Suzanne.
Great. Okay, thank you, Rolf. I really appreciate it. And I'm enthusiastic about the development of this treatment technology and the potential that exists. And I know that all of the folks who have NPDES permits are also very invested in there being a workable and economically affordable treatment technology too. So thank you for sharing with us. We do have a couple of minutes. I know that we're relatively limited in our opportunity to participate with Teams webinar format, but if folks have questions, you're welcome to put them into the comment or into the chat. Otherwise, as we mentioned earlier, for the next steps for the MPCA implementation side of things, stay tuned. When we are working on your permit, we'll be happy to chat with you through these things. We'll be keeping our fingers on the pulse of what NRI and other research institutions are doing. We're appreciative for that work. Okay, looks like there's a question in the chat from Abby Morissette. How will watersheds with natural sulfate concentrations be addressed? That will be a question for Steve Weiss.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I fully understand the question there. Background sulfate, low or high? Could you specify? And I'm presuming higher or lower than 10. Or maybe that's not your question at all. Oh, you're talking about southwestern Minnesota.
High. Yeah.
Gotcha. Well, one thing to keep in mind is that we will be, not all waters are wild rice waters, are waters used for production of wild rice. We do have wild rice waters distributed throughout the state, but there are corners where there is not a downstream water. So that solves some of that port part. But in other areas, we will use 10 as the water quality standard that we will evaluate for limits until a site-specific standard may be developed, if/when, and then we'll be using permitting tools, primarily variances and schedules of compliance, to be able to move permittees through time. And over the next 5 years, in the next 5-year permit cycle, we anticipate developing a multi-discharger variance.
Yeah, and maybe, Abby, I'll search for your contact information in the attendees list and follow up with you on email too.
Okay, yeah, in those regions that discharge to the Mississippi River, again, we will use 10 until there would be another water quality standard that would be applicable, that would go through the administrative process. And feel free to get a hold of me if you have specific situations that you'd like to discuss in greater detail.
Yeah, a lot of this will be very specific to every facility, right? It's very specific to where the proximity is to a water use for the production of wild rice. Good. Well, I want to thank everyone again. Thank you for your time. Thanks for folks who are presenting and answering questions. And stay tuned for more. If you're an NPDES permit holder and you are upstream of a water use for the production of wild rice, we will likely be talking about this again in the future, and I look forward to it. So thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining. Take care.